So let me start off by saying my name is Tom McLaughlin. I have a company here in Boston called ServerlessOps. It is an AWS cloud and DevOps consulting company with a specialty in serverless. And I'm here to present to you Serverless DevOps. What do we do when the server goes away? Now, this isn't a pure tech talk at all. It's more about how technology affects people and process. In particular, how serverless the technology affects someone like me, an ops person. Would have been great if I started this with my clicker. You're going to edit this part out, right? I had it here somewhere. There it is. Thank you. It was behind my Mac. Okay, there we go. So I started working with Lambda about 2 years ago, and my first experience left me with this very unsettling feeling. You're going to have to edit a lot out on this one. There we go. So my task was to take some JSON from one API and shove it into another API. Very common task. And I didn't feel like spinning up an auto-scaling group or doing any configuration management work, so I went serverless for the first time. And I eliminated a few hours of work and toil. What I also did was bypass my old team. I used to be in ops, no longer was, and I was able to get something out and running without them. And that reminded me of a particularly rough incident in my career. I was on the technical operations team of a SaaS product company, okay? And I had already left one company which had said, we're never doing this DevOps thing, you know, this isn't for us. So where I was at the time, I felt, wait, I'm ahead of the pack, I'm pretty safe in my career, I can feel comfortable. Eventually, my VP of engineering comes to me and says that if I don't code, then I'm really just another IT person, which was a really crappy moment in my career, okay? I basically got told that all my Puppet experience, ability to deliver infrastructure, et cetera, was actually not valuable to this organization. There's no happy ending to this story. I left about 2 months later. I was trying to learn Java, I was not picking it up, and figured it's better for me to just leave now instead of just suffer the indignity of being fired because I was somehow no longer capable of doing my job. So, how many of you can actually relate to this story? Yeah, there we go. Okay, how many of us struggle with DevOps adoption? We had friends or colleagues. You had those successive bimodal IT reorgs and the people that kept being left in sad mode. As a result of that incident I just talked about, I am routinely worried about no longer being qualified for my job, okay? And when I started looking at serverless, I became concerned about this again. And that's really how my company and this talk came about. But this is kind of a sad note, and nobody's here to listen to some sad story about my life, right? You want to hear about serverless. This is what you're here for. This is what gets you excited. You want to hear about functions as a service, event-driven architecture, and so on. And so let's get started at least with what I'm talking about. First, what is serverless? Well, it's a cloud architecture defined by these 4 common characteristics. There's no servers, VMs, containers to provision or manage. Yes, there are servers, but they are not ones that I actually care about or have any access to. Next, I pay only for what I actively use. So if nobody is using my application, I'm not paying for it. Moving on, my system components scale with usage. I'm not responsible for allocating more AWS Lambda function instances to handle an increase in traffic. And finally, availability and fault tolerance is built in. You might be used to provisioning a message queue, and you have 3 of them in different availability zones. No, I provision one AWS SQS queue, and Amazon has done the rest underneath for me. And this is basically what functions as a service kind of looks like. I've got, say, a request, a message, or a state change. That is an event that happens in my architecture. And what that event does is trigger some bit of function code to just run. And that function code can do anything. In this case, it's going to take that event JSON, and it's going to, I don't know, put it into a data store, drop a message on a queue, send a message to a third-party API, etc. And this is something that we can build with a serverless architecture. So I use a lot of AWS icons, so I'll go through this. I got an object store, and it's got HTML, images, client-side JS, CSS, and it's fronted by a CDN. And there's no Nginx server involved that I'm aware of, okay? And if you look even closely, you notice there's not even like a function instance or anything like that. Moving on down, we got that weird yellow blocky thing that's an API gateway. An API gateway is something where I configure a path and an HTTP verb, and I say, if you, really? It's always spam when they call me too. Yes, if you post some JSON to this endpoint, it's going to trigger some code to run. And in this case, it's going to take that data that we sent it, and it's going to insert it into a data store. And that state change on that data store puts an event on a stream where we got another where we have another function that picks that event up, and it shoves it into that question mark that represents your entire understanding of what your organization does and how it actually produces money, such as the money that pays your salary. There we go. And finally, you ship it to production, and it looks like a giant Rube Goldberg device. This is what, I mean, event-driven architecture really just reminds me of a Rube Goldberg device. It's amazing. But as I said, I'm not here to give a straight-up tech talk on how you operate a giant Rube Goldberg device. Because just focusing on the technical aspects of serverless is how you get, just focusing on the technical aspects of things is how you get, there is no cloud, it's just someone else's computer. How many times have you heard that before? Yes, thank you. If you migrated to the cloud, you made no organization or process changes, you're really not making the most out of your cloud transition at all. The corollary to today is anytime someone says the word serverless, Mr. Well actually pops up out of nowhere to remind us that there are still servers involved in serverless. Yes. Look, focusing on event-driven architecture, functions as a service, or the name gets in the way of how this actually is going to affect mine and many of your roles going forward. So let's talk about this. What does serverless mean for an ops person like you or me? How is this going to change your role? And this is where I think things are going to be going over the next many years. I love this slide. It wakes people up. Get rid of your ops team. It either wakes people up or makes people angry. I really, truly believe this, and I am an ops person, and I'm going to go into why I actually believe this. So there's more definitions of DevOps in this room than there are actual people, but I feel obligated to add one more. This is the fictional beginning of your organization. There are two functionally aligned teams called Dev and Ops. And then DevOps transformation started happening. Typically, it went like this. Somebody proclaimed that they tore down the walls between their silos, and DevOps happened. How many times have you heard tear down the wall between silos over like the last 8 years in a conference talk? Somebody got like a square on conference talk bingo right now, didn't they? But this is more like what a product company looks like. You have these multiple functionally aligned teams that all exist in the service delivery process. And all those teams are needed to get something out the door, but they're all traveling in their own individual directions. Okay, they have their own wants, needs, and success criteria. And then product engineering teams started to realize that this wasn't actually a very efficient model. So they formed product pods, feature teams. I call them value delivery teams. They are cross-functional teams aligned along a particular business capability or problem. And they're not just dev teams, okay? They're not just devs. There's a PM in there, there's a designer, okay? They're all required to get something out the door. But us, we're too busy still over here. We're too busy over here because somebody has to operate the levers of the infrastructure. Somebody has to deploy Kubernetes. But while we've been talking amongst ourselves about like the DevOps principle of flow, you can see that other parts of the organization have actually been realigning themselves to achieve this. And if your organization goes with a serverless first mentality, where they assume your applications are going to be serverless unless it can't fit that model, those teams don't need to go through you to get out the door to the user. Your only option is really to play toll booth operator for these teams, where your role exists out of a matter of policy and not actual need for the user. So you can remain secluded and bypassed, or here we go. This is what I actually see for ops teams going away. I see us leaving our teams and joining these value delivery teams. So to be clear, I think ops teams should go away, not ops people. I think we are tremendously valuable to these teams. And this is, to me, this DevOps promised land that many of us have been talking about for a while. We have these group of people with different expertise that are required to efficiently get something out the door to reach a user. There we go. There's my user. So now that you've left, you've joined this value delivery team, what are you going to do? What is your role going to be? That is the big question. Where do I fit within this? So the way I look at it is you're going to be climbing up the stack. And you're going to be looking at your old work from a different vantage point, and you're going to be looking at new work that you're not necessarily familiar with. So here we are today. I have a server, and I worry about CPU, disk, and memory, right? And I got to patch the latest security vulnerability that has a logo. And why do I run this server? It's because somebody needs a MongoDB database somewhere in our environment. I also need to make sure it's not blowing up at 3 a.m. or something like that. And because it's scaling, I got to figure out how to run 3 of these. Moving on, I got legitimate coworkers that need to be able to access this service. And I got not legitimate Viking kitten who I don't want to plunder my data. So that's today. So now your organization goes serverless. That's a giant white gap in there that used to be all the work I was responsible for. That work has been taken over by my cloud provider. We've replaced MongoDB with an AWS DynamoDB table. So we're going to look at DynamoDB slightly differently. We're going to look at it as just one service within a running application. All the questions I had about reliability and performance of DynamoDB, that's affected by that function right over there, okay? I need to look at those two things and more in tandem with one another. And I care that my legitimate coworkers can deploy the cloud resources that they need to build their application. And I want to make sure legitimate Viking kitten is not plundering all my data in S3 and causing a breach. Plus, I care about users. I care about how my user experiences this application. We're going to come back to our user in a little bit. Scale out further. Well, our application starts to look like this. This is a hypothetical ride-sharing application. What I need to do is make sure that when that user makes a request, and there is a surge of requests, that I've recorded everything, and I've actually billed this user so that I can pay that driver. This isn't a bunch of web-based microservices, if you notice that. I only got one, okay? Event-driven architecture, you cause one event and it just causes a cascade of events throughout the entire system. That is legitimately very hard. Like, that is actually new to me and still something that I am wrapping my head around, you know, this much later. So let's move on from architecture and let's talk about developer experience and enablement. For me, this means my job is to make sure that my developers are focused on solving business problems. I handle technical questions and issues that don't contribute to solving a business problem directly. So let's start with tools. I got Serverless Framework and AWS SAM. 2 tools for managing serverless applications in your environment. I'm on a project right now. I've been building SAM templates for the rest of the team. I've been doing that because I can reduce about 1 to 2 hours of boilerplate configuration and setup down to 1 to 2 minutes. And it goes out the door, and each time somebody creates a new service, all those things are in place. I'm going to be managing the CI/CD pipelines. Somebody needs to create a new service. I need to make sure that the CI/CD pipeline is in place for that. I need to handle the automated testing and the automated security testing for these services. All of this is work that a developer can do, sure. But do you really want them focused on playing with CI/CD pipelines, or do you want them actually developing applications and features to solve problems? And that brings me to this. In ops, our traditional domains have been things like configuration, architecture, reliability, security. There we go. But we really need to code. I can't say this enough. I got into this profession because I didn't want to code, but there's no way around it. Like, if you go serverless, you need to start picking these things up. When I am on a team that I don't know the language that the rest of the team is using, I immediately become significantly less productive on that team. The amount of tasks that I can handle on that team shrinks. Now, I don't think you need to be a senior developer level, be like a senior developer or anything like that, but you should be able to read and understand your application's code. You should be able to explain what it's doing. You should be able to find and fix minor bugs. You should be able to review PRs and tell people, hey, you might, this code might fail under these conditions. You should probably be trying something like this. And we need to stop setting people up for failure by telling them you don't need to code. Okay, I see this a lot in the ops community, saying, nope, you don't need to code, you'll be just fine. That is setting somebody up for failure years down the road. This is where I see us actually going, on a technical level. We're moving from operating infrastructure to operating applications. Which brings me to this. You've heard the term, how many people have heard the term shift left? Yeah, that's another conference, bingo check mark. Well, that shift left, we always people think, oh, it ends at development, right? Ops just moves over to development. It doesn't end there. It continues on into product. I work for a lot of product companies. If you're saving time and toil on infrastructure work by going serverless, I'm going to challenge you to not spend that new time on more technology, okay? I'm going to challenge you to spend more time understanding what you're building, why you're building it, how it actually contributes to your business, and how do you tell if it's actually producing value to your organization. How many people here confer with product teams about projected growth for their applications? Yeah, you were ahead of the pack. Sorry for pointing you out. So you don't have a projected growth for your application. Do you just wing it for the scale that you need? Do you just make numbers up? Yes, that is true. We need to get past that though. We have people that potentially have numbers that can tell us what we actually need to be building for. And we should be using these real and projected growth numbers to actually inform our technical decision making. I want to know what my application needs to look like today versus tomorrow. I've worked in a lot of startups. What we build today isn't necessarily what the application needs to look like tomorrow at all. And we can use these real and projected numbers to actually figure out where scale points are and where we should be spending our time when. I like this one too. This is contrived, but it's user sentiment versus performance. How many, can anybody here usually say, they know what good enough means for performance for their application? Okay. Well, how about this? What if you're refactoring or re-architecting your application, you're making it faster, but you've literally budged nothing from your user. Your user is still unhappy. You're probably focusing on the wrong problem. You've probably just made a feature faster in an application, but that feature's not what the user really wants to solve their problem. This is how a lot of us still look at what we're building, okay? We have an API gateway, and it triggers a Lambda function, and it shoves some JSON into DynamoDB. And this is what we really need to start thinking about, even as ops professionals. Okay, I have a user and I want them to be happy, and they are going to interact with my organization through some sort of interface. And they send us data, and we're going to process that data, and we're going to store it because it's valuable to us, and that is what our organization does to produce some sort of value. And serverless, in its promise of faster iteration and value delivery, it's also a very efficient means of delivering garbage if you're not actually paying attention to these sort of things. On the left, who here is running Kubernetes? Who here is running Kubernetes in production? What we're doing right now is a lot of work saying, how do I transport some JSON from one API to another? You go serverless, and that question changes. It changes to, why am I transporting this JSON from one API to another? And what actual value did it create in our organization? This is very fundamentally different mindsets, all just driven by that change in technology. I want to understand how my organization works, how it creates value, and what it itself actually values. Okay? The infrastructure details, serverless remove the infrastructure details so we can focus on the things other than engineering. And my new time should be looking at, feature adoption. Is what we delivered actually being used? It should be looking at customer sentiment. It should be looking at the amount of support tickets that are actually generated within our organization. I say this a lot. I don't want to operate infrastructure anymore. And it's cool if you do, but I don't. I'm tired of doing it. I've been doing it for a number of years, and it feels like Groundhog Day, where we're doing much the same work with different tools. I didn't get into this profession because I like engineering. I got into this profession because I like solving problems, and technology actually gives me the tools to solve people's problems. That means I get to spend more time thinking about that, thinking about my user whom I mentioned before. Okay, this is the person that actually gives value and meaning to my work. If nobody's using my application, what value did I actually create? What was the purpose of that work? And that's what excites me the most about serverless, okay? It's less emphasis on running infrastructure, and more emphasis on solving that person's problem. And that person's problem has always been something that we know has been part of our purpose, but it's been obscured away by all these layers of technology and infrastructure that we have to run. So I used to end this talk somewhere around here. That's why there's a blank slide. But Josh told me I got 30 minutes up here, so I decided to extend this talk. Is this happening tomorrow? Is everything I said happening tomorrow? No, not at all. I was at DevOps Days, New York City, back in like January, and I was in an open spaces with about 30 plus people. And when I asked, who here uses serverless, 5 hands went up, and 3 of them all work together. We're not even at the stage in the hype cycle where people are lying about going serverless, okay? Or lying about running it. You know, the question of, okay, who here is running Kubernetes and who here is running Kubernetes in production? I did a Google trend graph, which is definitely not scientific, but you can see the difference in the Kubernetes curve versus the serverless curve. There's definitely a disparity in hype. So for more fun, I did this curve. That is VMware versus AWS. You see AWS was just a very long, slow crawl. And that's what I think serverless is going to be. It's not going to take off overnight. But this is the problem. You either have a ton of time to prepare and say, you're right, what do I want to be doing? What are the skills that I need for where I want to be 5 years from now? Or you have the time to say, it's never going to happen to me. You can watch the march of technology and keep saying, I'm not going to get hit by this. I actually don't see the excitement for serverless in smaller organizations. Smaller, less mature organizations that are typically more agile and more risk prone are not the places where I'm seeing serverless adoption. Where I'm seeing it is in very large organizations. I'm seeing it in organizations that are making a decision and saying, can we run a Kubernetes cluster at the scale that we need to support all of our development efforts? And some of them are saying, we're not sure we can do that. And AWS, or whatever our cloud provider is, actually provides services so we don't have to. So that's companies like Coca-Cola is one of the big ones. They're adopting this sort of stuff. And that's what's blown many of us for a loop in the serverless world. We didn't expect this to happen. So if you are at a larger organization and thinking that serverless is going to come way down the road, no, it potentially could be coming within the next few years for you. Very different than what we've normally seen with technology. And what I think we also need to do is remember that what many of us are doing today with DevOps and stuff was the result of many of us challenging the status quo, 8, 9, 10, 11 years ago and saying, how do we redefine our role? My job 8 years ago was dramatically different than what I was doing 3, 4 years later. And I think it's time for us to start rethinking what the ops role is again, especially in light of this idea that the infrastructure is potentially going away in our organizations. And that's why I've started to say this. Operate applications, not infrastructure. Any work involving operating, infrastructure or a platform is really just a bump in the road to where operations is probably going. And with that, yes, I do have an ebook if you want to read it. It's actually pretty good, and I don't even ask for your email address or anything like that. You can just take a picture of the QR code and download it. With that, who wants to ask questions? Nobody wants to be the first. Yes.
Hello?
Yep.
So again, the question was, how do you deal with the conversation about trust when you move from an on-premise type application to a in the cloud and ultimately serverless?
Let me think. I think the first question is the question of trust between going from the data center to in AWS, regardless of going serverless. Those are questions I haven't run into as much. I mean, the quick answer I usually give is compare your security team to the AWS security team and the scale at which they're working and the sort of people that they're hiring. That is part of my answer. Most of the companies I deal with are already in AWS or have already made the decision that they are going to AWS. So that I can't really answer too well.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Nobody wants to ask me about my cats? Oh, yeah. I have 2 cats, Cinnamon and Nutmeg. They're wonderful.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much, Tom.
Perfect.